The idea of God has been with humanity for thousands of years. We see drawings on the walls of ancient tombs and temples all over the world. People regard God as the creator and foundation of humanity. This is particularly vivid in Christianity, where this faith is not just a trust in God, but a belief in a moral framework and worldview. The Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson also speaks with great passion about God, values, and the responsibility we have towards truth. He also raises the importance of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche on these subjects. Nietzsche was not just a philosopher, but the equivalent of what we would now call a moral social psychologist, as much of his work inspired Freud, who built the foundation of psychology as we now know it. Nietzsche was like a doctor diagnosing his patient, and this patient was the European society in the greater world. The diagnosis he gave to this society was that of nihilism, which is a form of depression and meaninglessness. In his book, The Gay Science, Nietzsche prophesies that, quote, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murders? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? End quote. It is hard for us, the people of modern societies, to truly understand the gravity of Nietzsche's declaration. In 19th century Germany, this prophecy of God's death was monumental. It was the equivalent of saying that there is no such thing as justice or love. Europeans at the time were oblivious to this prophecy, as they still fervently believed in God. Nietzsche, in this sense, was ahead of his time, as he saw how belief in religion and God was becoming less central to daily life. He recognized the future secularization of Europe and, in effect, America, which we are currently living through. The world in Nietzsche's era was vastly different to the world that we live in today. The United States was in its infancy, with just over 5 million people living there. The idea of evolution had just been discovered by Darwin. The word dinosaur was invented along with the light bulb, and the first car was sold. Even the great wars were yet to happen. Many of the technologies and advancements that we take for granted today were invented in the 19th century. This was the start of modern society as we now know it. This realization was a deeply personal and troubling discovery for Nietzsche, who had originally planned to become a priest. However, with the onset of science, he could see the writing on the wall. He saw God's death and this increasing secularization as both freeing and also extremely dangerous. To fully grasp this understanding that Nietzsche came to, it might help us to create a personal analogy. Let us say that you were raised by a family which you thought gave birth to you, only to be told 70 years later that it was actually a lie and that you were adopted. Now imagine that this lie was told to you for thousands of years. This falsehood has now become part of your biological evolution. It affects your taste and your basic ideas about the world. God has been this foundation for thousands of years, and in many ways still is. We see this in politics all over the world, with references to God Save the Queen, God Save America, and even in pop music, with Ariana Grande's song, God is a Woman. This realization of God's death and its cultural impact is, however, happening in America and Europe. An example of this is the book by Robert P. Jones called The End of White Christian America and The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. Both of these books touch on these points of secularization and the influence of Christianity on the West. According to Alan Pratt, Nietzsche argues that, quote, under nihilism's withering scrutiny, the highest values devalue themselves, the aim is lacking, and the why finds no answer. Inevitably, nihilism will expose all cherished beliefs and sacrosanct truths as a symptom of defective Western mythos. This collapse of meaning, relevance, and purpose will be the most destructive force in history, constituting a total assault on reality, and nothing less than the greatest crisis of humanity. In Nietzsche's own words, he states, what I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. For some time now, our whole European culture has been moving as towards a catastrophe with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade, relentlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach its end." End quote. In Nietzsche's eyes, he saw that this nihilism and devaluing of this life we live in now comes from Plato's theory of forms and idealism, and by extension Christianity too, which took many of the ideas from Plato, who is the father of Western philosophy. The theory of forms are ideas, according to Plato, that lie in another world, sort of like a holiness in a Christian sense. However, we don't have access to these pure forms of beauty, love, justice, or redness that all lie in this other world of forms. So, for example, in the Phaedo, we are told that particular sensible equal things, like equal sticks or stones, are equal because of their participation or sharing in the character of form of equality, which is absolutely, changelessly, perfectly, and equally equal. So we have two worlds, according to Plato, this world and the world of forms. Any interaction we have with the forms in this world, for example, the forms of beauty, love, justice, redness, are a poor, imperfect manifestation and not worth the same as the pure, perfect forms in the other world of Platonic forms. Nietzsche attacked Plato for placing so much importance and emphasis on the other world of perfect ideas and not this one. Nietzsche argues against Plato's forms, and in Beyond Good and Evil he calls it the worst, the most tiresome, and the most dangerous of errors, which has been a dogmatist error, namely Plato's invention of pure spirit and the good in itself. If we use Plato's idea of pureness and idealism, which has become part of our evolutionary thinking, how can goodness come out of Christianity if Christianity is a lie? How can art be good if it comes from a tyrant or a sexual deviant? Both are impure, and therefore we diminish its value. We deny its flawed humanity as we look for too much purity. We look too much for Plato's forms. And in many ways, Plato's idealism denies this human world of imperfection. This perfectionist way of thinking destroys humans, as, like Nietzsche said, we are only too human, and nothing is ever perfectly pure. Nietzsche states, quote, "Man has lost the faith in his own value when no infinitely valuable whole works through him. He conceives such a whole in order to be able to believe in his own worth." Nietzsche states man has lost the faith in his own value when no infinitely valuable whole works through him. He conceives such a whole in order to be able to believe in his own value. Nietzsche sees this nihilism continue in Christianity, which has been the foundation for Europe and America for the past 2,000 years, and was inspired by Plato through the works of Augustine. When Nietzsche talks about Christianity, he is talking about Paul's vision, and not that of Jesus, as according to Nietzsche, there would be no Christianity without Paul. Here, Nietzsche is not saying that God does not exist, but now that we have stopped believing in him, he is dead. We made him live by believing in him, and now that we don't believe, we have killed him. Nietzsche outlines the nihilistic meaning inherent in the moral lifestyle of Christianity by stating, quote, "I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity, the one great instinct for revenge, for which no expedient is sufficiently poisonous, secret, subterranean, petty. I call it the one immoral blemish on mankind," end quote. Christianity, in Nietzsche's eyes, is hostile to life. It's a religion of pity. It puts down the mighty in favour for the weak and the poor. This results in an inversion of nature. According to Nietzsche, we can also see this streak of denial in Buddhism. Christianity, on one hand, is a struggle against sin. Buddhism, on the other, is a struggle against suffering. This denial of life continues in the Christian ascetic ideal. Asceticism is a lifestyle of abstinence from sensual and bodily pleasures in the pursuit of spiritual goals, which is roughly the lifestyle of a priest or a Buddhist. Stephen Mulhall argues that, quote, "the ascetic ideal is the term Nietzsche uses in the genealogy of morals, for the various ways in which value systems of slave morality evolves, basically valuing weakness, obedience over strength. Asceticism and other worldly religions carry with them the baggage of guilt and the rejection of the values of human life in its actual earthly and bodily settings. This ramifies and spreads out into the broader reaches of Judeo-Christian Western culture, and the concept that appears to play the decisive role in facilitating that mutation, which is truthfulness, hence truth. According to Nietzsche, it is because of this we can't take Christian values without God either, as Christianity is inherently nihilistic and devalues people who are creators and puts the weak over the strong. He attacks the ideas that do continue this Christian morality. These are the theories of equality, socialism, and democracy, in a sense modernity, as these ideas deny that society throughout history has been created out of bloodshed and pain. These ideas in fact deny suffering and exchange it for utopian idealistic thinking, a form of hedonism, for which Nietzsche has no time for. He says, quote, "To those human beings who are any of concern to me, I wish suffering, desolation, sickness, ill treatment, indignities. I wish that they should not remain unfamiliar with profound self-contempt, the torture of self-mistrust, the wretchedness of the vanquished. I have no pity for them, because I wish them the only thing that can prove today whether one is worth anything or not, that one endures." End quote. In Nietzsche's eyes, these soft people of democracy, socialism, and equality cannot build society, as they are not strong enough, as society is built by barbarians. Much of this critique can be applied to the culture wars of American politics. So, how can we understand the suffering and meaninglessness of this world now that the ideas of heaven and idealism and any form of salvation is gone? Nietzsche's answer is freedom, pure freedom, and a re-evaluation of all values. Nietzsche goes on to say, quote, "Now when it has been surmounted, when Europe is rid of this nightmare, we can again draw breath freely and at last enjoy a healthier sleep." End quote. However strong Nietzsche's attack is on Plato and Christianity, it is a bittersweet critique. He says, let us not be ungrateful to it, as these falsehoods of Platonism and Christianity raised us. They gave us life as we now know it. We can see something similar to this in Plato's Republic, where he outlines the importance of noble falsehoods in order to create civic harmony. And yes, according to Nietzsche, who goes on to say, quote, "The struggle against Plato, or so to speak plainer, and for the people, the struggle against the ecclesiastical oppression of millenniums of Christianity, has, in fact, produced in Europe a magnificent tension of the soul, such as not existed anywhere previously. With such a tensely strained bow, one can now aim at the furthest goals." End quote. Here we have seen Nietzsche playing the role of a psychologist, assessing the impact and legacy of religion in Europe over thousands of years. However, many people disagree with this and say that Nietzsche was not a nihilist, as he believed in the will to power, the Übermensch, and a form of overcoming, in a sense becoming the nobleman. And yes, Nietzsche did have these ideals, as hypocritical as it sounds when compared to his attack on Plato and Christianity. But these ideals were not nihilistic by nature. They accepted the human imperfection, and they valued this life. The problem here is that Nietzsche did not want to be a nihilist. Like the diagnosis of cancer or any other disease, it is not good for human beings to lie to themselves about reality. Nietzsche here is urging us to fight against this meaninglessness and accept it and embrace it and give it a Dionysian yes, to live and create your own values. Nietzsche says that there is no foundation now that God is dead. We must become our own foundation. We must become creators and free spirits and not be dogmatic. And now with the strained bow created by Christianity and Platonism, we can be free and aim at the furthest goals. We can question and adventure like we have never questioned before, and accept the imperfection of life and the suffering and fraught dangers that come with it. Nietzsche's reflections raise serious questions. Do you agree with Nietzsche's diagnosis? Are we really going through this secularization? And do you think that Nietzsche's answer is good enough? Or do you even think that Nietzsche's ideas are applicable to our current political era? If you like this work, please share, like and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, as your donations make this work possible.